Growing skepticism with Mexican president's drug plan, with growing violence and a deadly attack in the north of the country. Just what will it take to root out this problem? Is drug legalization the answer? And what role would the US play in Mexico's drugs war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. Mexico's new drug frontier, casinos. A fatal arson attack on an upscale casino has killed 52 people. The government has now launched a new offensive against this gaming boom and the illegal activities associated with it. The brazen attack last week was the worst on civilians since the massacre of 72 migrants last year. And those responsible, according to the Mexican president, Felipe Calderon, are the drug cartels. As the violence becomes more brutal, Calderon appears to be losing his war on drugs. He first ordered a crackdown against the cartels when he took office in late 2006. However, turf wars between rival cartels have since killed about 42,000 people. Calderon has again demanded a crackdown on drugs in the United States, urging Congress to stop illegal trafficking of weapons across the border into Mexico.
The United States should help out, at least to avoid letting the dollars that come into Mexico generate this kind of suffering that we Mexicans do not want.
Let's jump straight into this subject with our guests. In Mexico City, Andre Laju, political activist and editor of Nexos magazine. In Washington, D.C., Bill Piper, who is the Director of National Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance, and from London, Paul McGrath, Director of Violent Risk Forecasting at Exclusive Analysis. Mr. Laju, what is it that we are looking at here with this recent, if you could call it, massacre at a casino in the north of the country? Are casinos now being viewed as the new frontier in the drugs war?
Yes, casinos are viewed as a new frontier on the drug war, but I think that that's not completely correct, in the sense that casinos have become part of the interests of criminal organizations that are mainly focused on drug trafficking. These organizations that mostly take drugs from Mexico to the US, now they are selling protection to other commercial venues, particularly casinos, because they can launder money there fairly easy. But still, the main issue is that the source of income these criminal organizations have comes mostly from drug trafficking, and with this money they've been able to buy hundreds of thousands of weapons and to build organizations that are terrorizing part of the country.
Mr. McGrath, how are you viewing this latest event and this new focus by the government to stamp down or try and eliminate casinos if they can?
I think it's rather a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, Felipe Calderon had to do something. There has been controversy over the licensing of casinos in Mexico. Given the public outcry over the death toll of this incident, I think he has to do something. But really clamping down on casinos is really just a veneer, if you like. I really don't think it goes to the heart of the problem. As Andres rightfully said, you know, the drug cartels see casinos as an alternative source of income. It's one of many of their sources of income, including people trafficking, counterfeit goods, prostitution, etc., etc. So this is just one of the many elements that allows them to buy their weapons and buy their influence. So I don't think that going after casinos per se is going to have much of an impact.
But what really strikes me about this is the brazen attack, the fact that the men went in there, apparently very relaxed, set the casino on fire, people were burned to death. I mean, it's just as if they feel they can do this with impunity. Indeed.
I mean, I personally don't think they perhaps intended such a high death toll. Obviously, if you're pouring petrol and setting fire to it in a public place, that risk exists. But you know, I'm not sure they really intended to kill more than 50 people. But this is just the latest indication of the trend of the more indiscriminate nature of the violence we're seeing in Mexico. You know, we see regular incidents of gunmen walking into bars and shooting dead 20 plus people. Grenades, rocket-propelled grenades also used in downtown Monterrey and major cities right on the border with the US. So yes, I think there is a feeling of impunity by the cartels.
Mr. Piper, how is this being viewed from the US, this escalation of violence in places like Monterrey?
Well, it's a lot like America during alcohol prohibition, only probably 1,000 times worse. And so I think there's a lot of Americans who are shocked that something like that, could happen. But, it's getting worse in Mexico, and as shocking as it is, I think we're probably going to see more things like that. There's just drug prohibition just creates such an enormous amount of money at stake that there's a lot of people willing to fight and kill over those profits.
Mr. Lejour, give us a sense of how this war is affecting people on a day-to-day basis, even those who are not involved in the cartels. Talk us through an everyday in your country.
Life has changed, particularly in the north of the country. We can't say that completely about Mexico City, but cities like Monterrey, Ciudad Juárez, Torreón, Saltillo, Durango, and Culiacán and Tijuana, people have stopped going out at night. Not only originally people stopped going out to restaurants and clubs, but now people don't even want to be on the street at night. So, for example, if you're invited by a friend to have dinner at home and it's past 11:30, you might as well stay there to sleep. People feel very unsafe while traveling any highway because drug cartels set up checkpoints on highways pretending that they're part of the Mexican army or the Mexican police, and that's where many people are disappearing, for example, in the state of Tamaulipas. Life has changed a lot. In Monterrey, what we saw last week probably will make people think twice about where they are going and if they feel safe, not only in commercial places but even at home, because some of the reaction of the police has been to go into people's homes to check if they can find any of the criminals that have been committing these crimes. So I think that the situation is getting worse.
And of
it's
course,
getting worse
many
because
policemen are linked to these
violent.
crimes, aren't they?
Many innocent people are being affected by these crimes, and the police sometimes is involved. So it's very hard to trust the authorities, particularly local authorities in northern cities.
Okay, Mr. Piper, Felipe Calderon says this type of violence is a sign of the cartel's weakness. Is that how you viewing it from where you are?
No, I mean, if this is, a sign of success, I'd hate to see what failure looks like. And, I think the families of the 42,000 people who have died wouldn't consider the policy, a success. And I think, what's going on is, they're fighting over these enormous amounts of profits, and whatever agreements that they had have been broken down. Once Calderon escalated, the drug war, that kind of threw out all the agreements a lot of these cartels had.
Okay, Calderon's current strategy has faced much criticism. His predecessor, Vicente Fox, suggested that Mexican authorities should now consider calling a truce with drug cartels. He said, and this is a quote, "I want to start a public debate on the following ideas, call on the violent groups for a truce and evaluate the advisability of an amnesty law." Could that work, Mr. McGrath?
No, I don't think so. I think there's far too much at stake for the cartels. Also, perhaps Mr. Fox is referring to previous agreements that allegedly were struck under the government of the PRI party in the 90s and before. And we're seeing a lot of suggestions now that given that PRI are highly likely to win the elections in July next year, could they resuscitate some of these previous agreements that allegedly took place with the cartels? But I think that this is a red herring, really, because the cartels today are much different from when they were in the 80s and 90s. Although they do obviously continue to derive a lot of their income from drugs, they're now transnational criminal organizations. They have stakes in so many things.
And do you have the Don Juan type of character running this like a family, or is it just got too big for that?
Well, it's not even that it's got too big. You still do have the massive cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. But the Sinaloa cartel is the biggest. But even an organization like that is not very internally coherent. You often see internal divisions within the cartels. It's not the fact the cartels are now too big. In fact, on the contrary, we're seeing the cartels splitting into smaller units, so we're getting more competition over the same drug routes, the same domestic distribution, because domestic distribution is a very up-and-coming issue which is driving a lot of the violence. So you're getting more cartels, younger, hot-headed guys that are now running them. So I think Mr. Fox's idea of doing a deal with these sorts of organizations just doesn't have any legs at all.
You talk about domestic abuse or domestic distribution. Mr. Lajean, apparently the domestic use of drugs has increased dramatically. What do you think is behind that?
Well, there's not a dramatic increase, although there is an increase. I think that the problem is that we're not treating the public health problem that drugs create. We're focused, or Mexico's government is focused on security issues related to drug trafficking. And as we have seen for the last 50 years, prohibition has been a failure. Prices have gone down in the US, arrests have gone up in the US and in Mexico, but also drug use has gone up in both countries. So I think that the increase in drugs in Mexico, it's completely linked to keeping the focus on prohibition and not treating it as a public health issue, where the government should issue information and drug treatment to whomever is interested in having drug treatment, instead of treating people like criminals when they have a drug problem.
So does this raise again the issue of whether you should, excuse me jumping in, whether you should decriminalize or legalize drugs? I know that this is a debate that is raging within your country. How's it going to play out?
Yes. Actually, drug use has been partially decriminalized for very, very small amounts. However, the moment someone overpasses that small amount, it becomes drug trafficking. So in that sense, it's not the same situation as a country like Portugal. But legalization has become part of the discussion because President Calderon admitted that he is interested in discussing it. And last week, after the incident in the Casino Royale, he asked the US to find market alternatives to the drug problem. So he means basically that the US should be discussing legalization at the global level, so that the Mexican discussion would not only be a local discussion, even if it would still have a local impact.
Okay, Mr. Piper, is the US likely to do that?
I think it's likely that some US states will legalize marijuana at least in the next 2 to 4 years. Colorado State and Washington State will be voting on it probably in 2012. And so the U.S. government probably isn't going to consider legalization in the short term, but state governments probably will.
Mr. McGrath, what is your stance on this subject? How do you think Mexico should go to remove the drugs to undermine the power of the cartels?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's plain that the current strategy of just throwing military might at the problem is simply not working. In fact, it seems to be counterproductive. As you take out some of the senior cartel leaders, it just creates a vacuum which is filled by yet more violent groups. Yes, I think it is far and away time for discussion on looking at options of legalization. The California vote last November narrowly went against it. There was a lot of disappointment following that because that would have apparently taken away, the figures are very debatable, but potentially hundreds of millions of dollars from the cartels. So the whole premise of legalization would be that it would take away the economic power of the cartels. We've seen the same premise in Colombia, where $7 billion of US aid have seen, I think it's something like a 60% reduction in cocaine production over the past decade. That has certainly taken away power from groups like the FARC guerrillas. However, they often refer to this as squeezing the balloon effect. You address it in one area and it quickly goes to another. So legalization would certainly take away some of the economic power of the cartels. It would prevent them from buying so many guns, from buying off so many local officials. However, given they're now involved in so many other activities, legal activities, that would only be part of the solution.
Mr. Lejoux, what do you think the moral implications are of legalizing drugs? I mean, does this mean that you turn over production into the hands of the state?
I think there are various schemes that we could try for different drugs. Drugs, they are all not the same. It's not the same thing legalizing marijuana as legalizing heroin or cocaine. So maybe the production of something like heroin could definitely be on the hands of the state, but the production of marijuana could still be in the hands of small producers. And of course, the access to these drugs by consumers should be regulated in a different way. They have different impacts on health and different impacts on society. But what's important is that legalization would take away many of the violent black market effects that the current situation has, because drug cartels can't trust each other, they can't trust buyers and sellers, so they have formed armed groups to enforce their agreements. If they are not part of the Mexican legal system, there will be violence, and they will diversify that violence as long as they can make money out of the investment they make on infrastructure and guns.
Mr. McGrath, I know that you left Colombia because it was too dangerous, but it's changed there. They've had a rather successful war on drugs. What is it that they've done that other countries around the world could learn from?
Well, I mean, it's debatable just how successful the war on drugs has been in Colombia. The US under Plan Colombia, agreed by Bill Clinton, threw $6 or $7 billion of mostly military aid at the problem, focused on eradication of the crops. So in one sense, the drug production has fallen significantly, and therefore the amount of funds available to armed groups like the Marxist FARC guerrillas has reduced. We've seen kidnapping by groups like the FARC reduced from around 3,000 at the turn of the century to fewer than 200. Attacks on oil pipelines, including of US firms, and electricity towers has also fallen significantly. However, right now in Colombia, we're seeing the emergence of a new generation of paramilitary drug gangs. So the problem has not gone away. And in fact, the Colombian government itself has admitted in recent months that its current strategy of a military-led approach to this problem is not working. So the Colombian government now is de-emphasizing the military aspect, and it's pumping most of its resources into the police because it's no longer a rural insurgency problem. This is now more similar to Mexico, paramilitary gangs in urban centers.
So, Mr. Piper, do you think that there should be more cooperation between the US and Mexico when it comes to working with the military, training the military to be able to tackle this problem?
Well, it's certainly good for the U.S. to work with Mexico on an issue that is potentially a national security threat, to both countries. But ultimately, helping Mexico improve its military capabilities or better training police officers isn't really going to solve the problem. It might help them take down a few of the top drug cartel leaders, but as long as the demand is there, the supply is going to be there, and as long as you have drug prohibition, that supply is going to be controlled by organized crime. So really what Mexico and the U.S. should be talking about is how to legalize, regulate, and tax at least marijuana to take all the profit away from the drug cartels. They'll still get some money for some other things, but they'll have a lot less money. And at that point, maybe the police and the military will have a greater success, because without the billions of dollars that drug prohibition generally and marijuana prohibition specifically is given to the drug cartels, they would be very weak without that money.
But shouldn't the US be playing a much bigger role here? they are the world's biggest consumer of drugs. They represent a yearly 39 billion market for the Mexican cartels, because an estimated 25 million Americans from 12 years and older are using drugs. So in a way, the US is complicit here, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly demand is driving the supply. But, you know, this year is the 40th anniversary of the war on drugs in the United States. And over the last 40 years, we've arrested tens of millions of people for drugs. We've spent more than $1 trillion. We've violated all sorts of civil liberties. We have more people in jail than China or Russia. We have more young black men in jail than South Africa at the height of apartheid. So the U.S. has spent 4 decades fighting a drug war with very little success. And so, you know, it's good. We certainly should spend more money on treatment and prevention. But, you know, that's only going to go so far. I mean, as long as we treat drug use as a criminal justice issue, people are going to be afraid to seek help. So if we start treating it as a public health issue, you know, then maybe we can reduce the demand some. And of course, if we address prohibition and actually regulate marijuana and other drugs, then we actually really can control those drugs and control where they're sold, who has access to them, what's in them, and you know, we can establish all sorts of age controls so young people can't get them, etc.
Okay, Mr. Lejeune, I don't think the sale of arms so easily made in the US and heading over to your border helps the situation at all.
Yes, the sales of arms has increased from border states to Mexico, and the municipalities that are next to the border have been a related increase in homicides. That's fairly important considering the huge amount of homicides we've had for the last 4 years. So the combination of money from the drug market with easy access to assault rifles after the assault weapon ban was lifted in 2004 has increased the firepower of drug cartels, making them really strong organizations. And also, in parallel, the Mexican government has diverted its money and its budget to security, to the army and to the federal police force. That has had consequences on the budget, on civil liberties, and of course it's linked to arms and drug trafficking. That comes from mostly the US.
Mr. McGrath, it makes you wonder how many people have to die before this situation is resolved. What sort of picture are you painting for Mexico, the workings of the cartels, if this isn't resolved in the foreseeable future?
Unfortunately, I really think that things will get worse before they get better. You know, even after the government has thrown 50,000 troops at this problem, we've just seen the number of deaths spiral. You know, from the first year of the offensive in 2007, I think it's about 3,000. It's gradually gone up to 15,000 last year. You know, the monthly death toll now is, I think, 3 times what we're seeing in Iraq, for example. You know, we're getting shootouts with assault rifles, RPGs in metropolitan centers like Monterrey. You know, what is driving the violence? The government, you mentioned at the beginning, the government says that acts like the casino fire are acts of desperation. I don't see that at all. You know, the violence is driven not by the cartels reacting to what the security forces are doing against them, but rather the inter-cartel disputes. And as I mentioned previously, with the removal of cartel leaders via vendettas and via security force operations, we're just getting more groups coming in to fill the power vacuums. So I personally think that the turf wars that are driving this violence are very far from settled. I mean, what could end it? The various scenarios are perhaps one cartel could come to dominate the Sinaloa cartel. That is certainly the biggest cartel. So hypothetically, if they manage to take out a number of their rivals, they could exert a degree of influence nationwide. However, that looks unlikely. You know, partly because it's just so difficult for big organizations like these to stay coherent. They'll probably crack internally. What else could reduce the violence? You know, a massive US intervention. Okay. But on many levels, that's both not desirable and very unlikely.
A rather gloomy picture painted there by Paul McGrath in London. Thank you for talking to us. Also, Andre Lejeune talking to us from Mexico City, and in Washington, D.C., Bill Piper. Thank you very much for your thought and your time, gentlemen. And of course, thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye.